Right. Hello. My name is James, and I'll be talking to you about visual sensory, the anatomy of the eye, and how to assess the colour and appearance of wine by sight. So, firstly, before we get stuck in to the wine, why don't we have a look at the anatomy and the physiology of the eye to start things off. So, firstly, if you think of a camera, the human eye functions very much in a similar way to how a camera lens focuses light onto film. And just like a camera, the eyes need light to be able to form images and objects. So light enters the eyes, passing through the cornea, the transparent protective layer encircling the eye. The cornea acts as a lens by bending and refracting light. And then from the cornea, light travels through the pupil, and like the shutter on a camera, the iris, which is the coloured part of the eye, controls the amount of light coming in. The lens then focuses the light rays to the retina, where the image appears inversed. And finally, the optic nerve carries the light signals to the visual cortex, which is located in the brain. These signals are then rearranged by the brain to create the images that we see. So how do we actually perceive colour? Well, the human eye is capable of perceiving over 1 million colours. The eyes perceive colour when certain wavelengths enter the lens. These light signals then travel through to the retina, where photoreceptors shaped like cones and rods translate these light signals into the colours and images that we see. There are 3 different kinds of photosensitive receptors within the cones, each one being responsible for translating different wavelengths. So blue for short wave sensitive, green cones translate medium wave sensitive, and red cones long wave. These 3 wavelengths then overlap and create the ability to distinguish colours. Now, a failure by one of these cones will result in the eye being unable to distinguish certain colours. So if we have a look at this common sort of colourblind test, we have a number 5 here. Someone who was colourblind would have trouble distinguishing the number in the image. Pretty interesting. So, moving on swiftly, let's look at the mechanisms that link the visual appearance to sensory perception. Bum. Okay. So, as mentioned before, the eyes capture the light signals in front of it, which are sent to the visual cortex, which is here. It's sent as information, which is then reprocessed in the brain via the optic nerve. The visual cortex in the sensory cortex, this is being the sensory cortex here, translates this information into the images we see, as well as spatial awareness, contrast, background, foreground, etc. So the visual cortex makes up just one component of the sensory cortexes. These other components, being auditory, olfactory, gustatory, etc., are responsible for interpreting the sensory information it receives from different parts of the body. So what is sensory perception? Well, sensory perception is the complete process of receiving information through one of the senses, comparing this information with past experiences, identifying it, and evaluating it. Again, very interesting. So, let's move on to wine. I've had enough of this sort of anatomy stuff. So, the origins of colour in wine. So, the major source of colour in wine comes from the skins of the grapes and oxidation. Other colour contributions come from the levels of pH and sulfur dioxide in the must. Colour from the grape skins, along with other phenolic compounds, are extracted during fermentation. And the style and character of a particular wine are mostly determined by the amount and the quality of the phenolic compounds in the wine. So how does the colour of wine influence our senses? Well, in wine science, Jamie Good discusses what's known as the pre-attentive phenomenon, whereby automatic subconscious assumptions are made about the taste of something based on its appearance. So I suppose an example of that could be pale rosé, which is often asked for, in a wine bar. I guess people sort of have the predetermined idea that it's going to taste a certain way, which may or may not always be true. But again, those people can sort of care more about how it matches their handbag than how it actually tastes. And I guess another point to that is a fun fact about a PhD student in a university in Bordeaux by the name of Frédéric Bouchot. He gave 54 enology students a sample of white wine that had been dyed red using a tasteless red dye. And the expert panel overwhelmingly described flavors and smells that would normally be associated with red wine. So from that point, you can see how important it is, and also how I suppose the visual can impair our judgment. So let's look at the importance of the visual appearance when evaluating wine. So Alan Young, who wrote this very interesting book, Making Sense of Wine Tasting, he says, and I quote, "Even for the layman, colour and appearance are crucial parts of the total aesthetic appreciation of wine. It is my fervent desire to stand on the roof of every city hall in the world and shout aloud, 'Wine is all about colour and smell.'" So there are some key properties in wine that can be measured by sight, being clarity, brightness, depth, intensity, viscosity and spritz, colour and hue. So examples of what we can decipher using those properties, for instance, faults in the wine. So clarity can tell us if there are any obvious fault in the wine. The best example being unstabilized wines, which could produce tartrate crystals after cooling. And even though these are harmless, they're obviously not pleasing to the eye. However, there is now a demand for unfined and unfiltered wine, which can be cloudy, which some consumers may prefer these sort of more natural styles. For others, this can be a turn-off, by the aesthetic and also for the style of wine. Grape variety and region can also be more or less identified using colour. Can be a good indication for grape variety. For instance, Gamay is pale ruby and Pinot Noir ruby. Touriga Nacional can be deep purple and Cabernet Sauvignon deep ruby. And for white wine from cooler areas can often have a green tint. This tint could be coming from sort of unripened fruit being used to make the wine. For white wines that have been aged with a long battle maturation, they will develop honey and gold or a pleasant amber and brown colour, while long aging reds like port can be ruby in youth and when 15 to 20 years old can be very sort of tawny and brownish. The other measures that we can look at by sight, wine style. So grapes like Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc can create white wines that are yellow and gold in colour. And then with enhanced extraction during maceration and or aging in oak barrels, or limited amounts of oxygen during the winemaking process can contribute to a much deeper saturation of colour. So these techniques offer an alternative to the fresh fruity style, and by looking at them can be a good indicator to the consumer that that's the style of the wine. So again, just to see if you have a look here, often professionals will use these black glasses so they can't be confused by the colour of the wine. Wow. So yeah, let's have a look at one I prepared before. So here is a wine. So looking at this wine, we can say that it's pretty clean, which sort of suggests that it's not natural. So I'm not going to expect any sort of cidery or sort of farmy flavours. It doesn't really have any sort of golden hue or sort of anything that would indicate that it's been aged or barrel oaked or aged. So when we combine sort of the visual senses together with the other senses, then we can actually fully determine what the wine is, experience, and enjoy the wine. Thank you very much.